Unit 14. Unit 14. Global dominance after 9/11. Now we're actually going to start with the presidential election of 2000. Then we're going to go all the way down to 2010. So we're actually just going to look at the first decade of the 21st century. First of all, in the world, and also within the United States. The year 2000, of course, marks the turning of the not only the century but the millennium, second millennium after the birth of Jesus Christ. So it was a landmark year for the world, as well as for the United States. It was a time when there was great prosperity in the U.S. It was a time when there was prosperity in Europe. Many of the countries of the Third World were struggling, but they really weren't given a great deal of attention. But the United States developed, the United Nations developed a set of Millennium Development Goals in 2000 that were targets that they would hope to achieve within the next 15 years. And they had a lot to do with the state of the southern hemisphere of the world, the developing countries, to eliminate poverty, to eliminate illiteracy for women, to eliminate a lot of hunger and disease, to give people more of a sense of community control over their lives. So all these things were the part of the UN Millennium Development Goals, and so now in 2015, 15 years later, we're looking at whether those have been achieved. So I'm going to talk about that in the next module. And that will be the last module. So let's go back and talk about the world. This is a world in the year 2000, confident, relatively prosperous for the developing Northern Hemisphere countries, but the Southern Hemisphere countries, Africa and Asia and many of the countries in Latin America were falling behind. Actually, the gap between the rich nations and the poor nations was widening, even though the poor nations were making progress. They weren't progressing as fast as the rich Northern Hemisphere industrialized countries. There was also this whole emerging question of what globalization meant, because as we have seen, for some people globalization meant non-governmental organizations, growth in human rights, a growth in what was called international civil society, which was the sense that we're all tied together in a common world community of interests. And so whether it has to do with human rights, whether it has to do with the migration of people from one part of the world to the other, whether particularly it has to do with what we do with the environment and sustainable development, that we're all in this together, whether we're Japanese or Ukrainians or Nigerians or Canadians or Americans, that we all share a common destiny. Now that's one view of what globalization means. But then there's the other view that puts more emphasis on private investment and capitalistic economic development. And those advocates of globalization say, look, we've created jobs, we have, the Asian tigers have bounded forward and created wealth and created a whole new middle class in these shining cities like Hong Kong and Singapore and Tokyo and Beijing. And now China is investing in Africa, and it is, these multinational corporations are the hope of the world. They create consumer goods, they create jobs, they invest in science and technology, so that's the direction that we ought to emphasize. And so globalization means economic development under private enterprise. So those are two competing views. The business-oriented model, and if you will, the sort of human rights, community development-oriented model, are both two competing perspectives on globalization. Now, by the end of 2010, or actually just before the end of 2010, there was a world economic crisis, particularly in the United States in 2008. And that economic crisis resulted, of course, in a severe economic depression in the United States. It's partly one of the factors that led to the election of Barack Obama. And I'll talk about that very briefly. Now let's look at the United States. Now, in the presidential campaign of 2000, Al Gore ran against George Walker Bush. And both of them really had very little to say about foreign policy. In one of the presidential debates, Al Gore said there's really no difference in foreign policy between me and George Bush, which is really amazing when you look at what foreign policy, how today foreign policy has become a political football. Whether it's the Cuban relationships or whether it's the Iranian relationships, there is a deep division between Republicans and Democrats today over foreign policy. Didn't exist in 2000. So the Republicans won by they won by a very narrow margin, partly because of the dispute over the votes in Florida, but they took office. Now, there's a term, and I'm not going to take a lot of time, but you should look in your book about neocon. Neocon means neoconservative. Neoconservative. Now, the neocons were people who had been liberals, many of them, who now were conservatives. In the government, they included the Vice President, Dick Cheney. They included the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Pearl, I think, was the National Security Advisor at one point. Richard Pepys, who was another national security person. And of course, there were a number of think tanks in Washington that promoted the neocon point of view. And they said, look, this is the American moment. This is our new unipolar moment. This is our time when we are top dog. So we need a grand strategy. And that's in the article that's assigned for this module, the last article. We need a grand strategy. It's a good way to go. America is the last best hope of human civilization. The Europeans, they backed off of the Balkan crisis. They backed off of confronting the Russians. We are the hope of freedom and democracy. And so we have to, and if we have to act alone, if we have to act unilaterally, that's what we got to do. So that was the neocon view that was developing and gathering force even before 9/11. Now, Bush's people really focused on North Korea. They focused on a number of they focused on military superiority even over Russia, although Russia was no longer communist. And they didn't pay a lot of attention to surveillance of Islamic terrorism. They just didn't really pay a lot of attention to it. And then 9/11 happened, September 11th, 2001. This was a huge turning point in all of American history. It was a huge turning point in world history. It just totally shocked the United States. No one ever thought that anything like this could ever happen to us. And people just began to feel that we would never be safe until we went after these people. And so Bush announced the global war on terror. That he said that any country who shelters and harbors these people, we're going to get them. And so the first thing was to invade Afghanistan and to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We failed to assassinate UBL, Osama bin Laden, but we had a lot of troops on the ground. But the other terrorist, of course, was Saddam. And finally, in 2003, we invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam. Americans greatly overestimated their ability to achieve a settlement in Iraq. And they underestimated the power of Islamic terrorism and opposition. Dick Cheney said that the march to Baghdad was going to be a cakewalk. Well, it wasn't a cakewalk. There was still a lot of resistance even after Saddam was overthrown, and the resistance continued, and the Iraqis immediately set about Nouri al-Maliki. First of all, the whole idea that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction was a total creation and a lie and a fabrication, the Iraqi society was just totally fragmented between Kurds and Shia and Sunnis, so it was really impossible to build a nation in Iraq. And Nouri al-Maliki was a Shiite in a Sunni majority country, but he was a Shiite and who was supported by Iran and other Iraqi Shiites. The Iraqi Sunnis didn't like him, the Kurds didn't like him, and so the Iraqis, fought with each other a lot. Now we spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and so I'm going to let you do the reading, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But the other thing is our relationships with Europe and Latin America. Europe is still an economic center of the world. It's an area in which we really have not developed a clear foreign policy. The Obama administration has not developed a clear foreign policy. Many economic analysts say that we might have avoided the economic catastrophe of 2008 if we'd been willing to work more closely with the Europeans instead of trying to compete with them. That we have not clearly figured out a way of working with China. So I want you to read Wang Jiexi's article on China and how we're going to relate to China, because I'll have a couple of questions for you about China, because China is obviously the second most important country in the whole world. Some people would argue that it's equally on a level, if not maybe a little bit ahead of the United States at this point in world history. So that's a very important aspect of our relationships. The other one is South America. Now, all throughout South America, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a huge change in consciousness. Many of the Latin American countries first tried to accept the neoliberal capitalistic view, but then they began to turn towards more social democratic points of view. This was true in Brazil, it was true in Argentina, it was true in Chile, it was true in several countries. They began to develop more programs to help low-income poor people. And they looked to Cuba as an inspiration. And so many Latin Americans, even though they didn't share Castro's communist views, liked him because they felt he had cojones, that he was not afraid to stand up to Uncle Sam. So they admired his guts, even though they didn't share his communist philosophy. And gradually they began to open up their relationships with Cuba. And they put pressure on Washington to drop the sanctions and to open up relationships with Cuba. And here again, we're going to talk about that later in the last module. But the United States, during this time, after 2000, Castro gradually began to relax his communistic philosophy and move towards a more free enterprise system. So but the neocons during the Bush administration, down to 2008 at least, were in power and were promoting this idea of global dominance right up until 2011 even. Now around 2010, let's say, there was a question of global dominance, and particularly the failure of American efforts in Iraq and the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq led to a significant reassessment of American foreign policy, which we will see in the 14th and final module.